The whiskey hit his face before anyone in the room had time to process what was happening. 1 second, Vincent. The shark Torino was standing over him, glass in hand. The next, the liquid was dripping down Bumpy Johnson's chin, soaking into his collar. Running down the front of his perfectly tailored suit, 20 men watched it happen. 10 of Torino's soldiers, 8 of Bumpy's operators, 2 neutral witnesses from the old Italian families who had seen enough violence in their lives to recognize the exact moment when blood becomes inevitable. Except it didn't, because Bumpy Johnson didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't reach for the weapon that every man in that room knew he was carrying. He just sat there, perfectly still, with whiskey dripping down his face, and he smiled. Not a forced smile, not the tight, dangerous smile of a man suppressing rage. A genuine smile, warm almost, like someone had just told him something he had been waiting a long time to hear. Like Torino had just handed him an unexpected gift. That smile was the most terrifying thing anyone in that room had ever seen. To understand why, you need to understand what that room was. You need to understand what it meant in 1955 for a man to throw a drink in Bumpy Johnson's face in front of 20 witnesses. And you need to understand what Bumpy Johnson had spent the previous 3 months quietly, invisibly, patiently building in preparation for exactly this moment. Because the whiskey wasn't the beginning of this story. It was the end of the first chapter. And what came next would teach an entire generation of operators, from Harlem to Chicago to the private clubs of Midtown Manhattan, a lesson about the difference between power and the performance of power that they would never forget. Ellsworth. Bumpy Johnson was 48 years old in the winter of 1955. He had survived Alcatraz. He had built an empire that stretched from Sugar Hill to the docks. He had navigated the treacherous politics of mid-century New York organized crime with a combination of intelligence, patience, and an unbreakable personal code that had earned him something rarer and more durable than fear. It had earned him genuine respect. Not the respect that comes from the threat of violence, though Bumpy was capable of violence when it was necessary and had demonstrated that capability on enough occasions that nobody who mattered needed to be reminded of it. The respect that came from watching a man operate at a level of strategic sophistication that made everyone around him feel, correctly, that they were always 3 moves behind. He didn't rule Harlem by making men afraid of what he would do to them. He ruled Harlem by making men understand that crossing him was simply a bad business decision. That the machinery he had assembled, the loyalty he had cultivated, the information he had accumulated, made opposition not just dangerous, but futile. You didn't challenge Bumpy Johnson because there was no version of the challenge that ended well for the challenger. Vincent Torino had not received this message. Or rather, he had received it and decided it didn't apply to him, because Vincent was a mid-level capo in the Genovese family, and in his world the rules were simple. Italian blood meant something. Position in the family meant something. Being connected to the most powerful criminal organization in New York meant that you operated above the rules that governed men who didn't have those advantages. Bumpy Johnson was from Harlem, and in Vincent's understanding of the world, that fact placed him in a specific category regardless of his reputation, his wealth, or his demonstrated intelligence. It placed him in the category of men who could be pushed. Vincent had been pushing for months. He had moved heroin through Harlem, cutting into Bumpy's numbers operation. He had bribed 2 of Bumpy's lieutenants, or believed he had. He had ordered the beating of Marcus, the Book Williams, Bumpy's most trusted collector. who had been found half dead in an alley off 125th Street on a Tuesday morning with a message written in bruises that even a man who couldn't read would have understood. Torino isn't just moving product anymore. He's moving to take over. Most men in Bumpy's position would have responded with immediate, decisive violence. That was the language Torino was speaking. It was the language the streets understood. You hit me, I hit back harder. You touch my people, I touch yours. The escalation calculus was simple and well established. Bumpy did something else entirely. He requested a meeting. Word spread through both communities like electricity through wet copper. Bumpy Johnson was going to face the shark in neutral territory. A sit-down at Ralph's restaurant in East Harlem, the same back room where Italian and black crime families had been settling disputes for 2 decades. The terms were Torino's. The location was his choice. The format favored a man who believed that sitting across a table from Bumpy Johnson and looking him in the eye would establish, once and for all, who the real power in Harlem was. Every operator in the city who heard about the meeting drew the same conclusion. Bumpy was going to negotiate. He was going to offer Torino something to keep the peace. He was making a concession, acknowledging implicitly that Torino's moves had worked and that accommodation was preferable to conflict. They were wrong, every single one of them. Because Bumpy Johnson hadn't requested that meeting to negotiate. He hadn't come to fight. He had come to teach the most expensive lesson of Vincent Torino's very short remaining life. And he had spent the previous 3 months constructing the classroom with a precision that would only become clear long after the lesson was over. The night of the meeting, 20 men gathered in that back room at Ralph's restaurant. Torino arrived first, which was itself a statement. He took the head chair without being invited, poured himself wine from the bottle that had been placed at the center of the table, and started talking before Bumpy had even sat down. The message was clear. This is my room. These are my terms. You are here because I allow you to be here. Johnson, he said, not Mr. Johnson, not Bumpy, just Johnson. The way you address someone you've already decided doesn't deserve the courtesy of a title. You're getting old, getting soft. Maybe it's time to step back and let younger men handle the real business in Harlem. The insult landed in the room like something dropped from a height. The men on both sides of the table understood what it meant. Torino wasn't just disrespecting Bumpy. He was making a public declaration. He was telling everyone in that room, and through them, everyone who would hear about this meeting afterward, that in his estimation, Bumpy Johnson was finished. Bumpy nodded slowly, like he was considering the wisdom of something a professor had said. That's an interesting perspective, Vincent. Tell me more about this real business you're handling. And Torino, drunk on his own arrogance, started talking. He bragged about the corners he had taken, the collections he had muscled, the police he had bought, the fear he had spread through neighborhoods that had previously been under Bumpy's quiet authority. Each word was a performance, designed for the audience of soldiers and witnesses around the table. Each word was also, though Torino couldn't see this, a gift, an addition to a file that was already very thick and was about to get thicker. Then Torino reached across the table and grabbed the bottle of Bumpy's whiskey, the whiskey that had been poured as a gesture of respect at the beginning of the meeting. He took a long, deliberate drink, straight from the bottle, looked Bumpy in the eyes while he did it, set the bottle down slowly. The room understood what had just happened. Taking another man's drink wasn't just rudeness, it was a statement of dominance. It was Torino saying, in the unambiguous language of the streets, that what was Bumpy's could be taken at will. Bumpy didn't react. Torino stood up. He looked down at Bumpy with the full weight of his arrogance concentrated into a single expression, and he said the words that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "Matter of fact, old man, I think you've forgotten who you're talking to." And then he threw the rest of the whiskey directly into Bumpy Johnson's face. The room stopped breathing. 20 men, some of the most experienced operators in New York organized crime, sat in absolute silence and waited for the world to end. Because in their world, there was only one possible response to what had just happened: blood, usually starting immediately, usually starting with the man who had just committed the act. Instead, Bumpy Johnson sat perfectly still as the whiskey dripped down his face. He looked up at Torino, who was grinning with the satisfaction of a man who believed he had just won something important. And then, slowly, the corners of Bumpy's mouth turned upward. He smiled, real, warm, almost grateful. "Vincent," he said, his voice as calm as a Sunday morning in a quiet church, "I want to thank you for that." The confusion that followed was almost as thick as the tension. What kind of man thanks someone for humiliating him? What kind of street legend sits still for that level of public degradation? But Jimmy, the fish marronnier, who had been in the business for 30 years, was watching Bumpy's eyes. And what he saw there was not humiliation, not suppressed rage, not the calculation of a man deciding how to respond. What he saw was something that chilled him more deeply than any threat he had ever received: satisfaction. Bumpy had been waiting for exactly this moment, and it had just arrived. Torino's grin widened. "Look at that," he said to the room. "The great Bumpy Johnson takes a drink in the face and says thank you." His soldiers laughed. Genuine, comfortable laughter. They were watching a legend crumble in real time. It felt, to them, like Christmas morning. Torino walked around the table slowly, stopping behind Bumpy's chair, close enough that everyone in the room could smell the whiskey on his breath. "You know what I think, old man? I think you've been living off reputation for too long. I think underneath all those stories, you're just another tired street operator who forgot how this game works." He leaned down, his mouth inches from Bumpy's ear. "And I think it's time for someone with real vision to take what you've been mismanaging." Bumpy finally moved. Not violently, not dramatically. He reached into his jacket pocket, a movement that caused every hand in the room to shift slightly toward weapons, and removed a white handkerchief. Slowly, methodically, he wiped the whiskey from his face. He folded the handkerchief carefully and placed it on the table in front of him. Then he looked at Torino with that same calm that was starting to make even the most experienced men in the room deeply uncomfortable. "Vincent," he said, "before you take over anything, let me ask you something. Do you know why they call you the Shark?" The question caught Torino off guard. He straightened up. "What kind of stupid question is that?" "Humor me." Torino shrugged, his confidence returning. "Because I smell blood in the water. Because I circle my prey. Because when I bite, I don't let go." Bumpy nodded thoughtfully. "That's interesting. You know what I learned about sharks during my time inside Alcatraz?" He stood up slowly, and for the first time that night, something in his movement made the room genuinely tense. Not because he looked threatening, because he looked completely at peace. They're perfect predators in water, apex killers. Nothing can touch them in their element. But you know what else I learned about sharks, Vincent? Torino's smile was still there, but the edges of it had started to soften. Take them out of water and they suffocate. They die slow, gasping for something they can't find. Torino's laugh was louder this time, but it had an edge. What the hell are you talking about, old man? I'm talking about the fact that you've been swimming in my waters for 3 months, thinking you're the apex predator. Bumpy walked to the window overlooking the street, hands clasped behind his back like a general surveying a battlefield. But this isn't the ocean, Vincent. This is Harlem. And in Harlem, there are rules you don't understand. He turned back to face the room. For instance, did you know that every corner you've taken, every collection you've muscled, every cop you think you've bought has been reported back to me? The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Did you know that your own soldiers have been telling me about your moves for weeks? Torino's eyes went to his men, looking for signs of betrayal. Their faces revealed nothing. You're bluffing, Torino said, but his voice had lost the swagger that had filled it all evening. Am I? Bumpy returned to his seat without sitting down, placing both hands on the table and leaning forward. Tell me, Vincent, what did you do with the money from last Tuesday's collection on 145th Street? Torino's face went pale. That collection had been off the books, private, something only he and his most trusted lieutenant knew about. And what about the arrangement you made with Detective Morrison? The one where you promised him 20% of everything in exchange for looking the other way when your boys got rough with my numbers runners. Morrison was dirty, but that deal had been buried deeper than anything. The fact that Bumpy knew about it meant either Morrison had talked or someone even closer to Torino had been feeding information. Or my personal favorite. Bumpy continued, his voice never rising above conversational level. The letter you wrote to Don Castellano asking permission to eliminate me. The one where you called me, and I quote, an aging relic who's forgotten that evolution always wins. The blood drained from Torino's face completely. That letter had been hand-delivered by his most trusted courier to Castellano's private residence. The only way Bumpy could know about its contents was if Castellano himself had shared them, or if the courier wasn't as trusted as Vincent had believed. You see, that's the difference between a shark and a chess master, Bumpy said. Sharks attack what they see. Chess masters control what their opponents don't see. He walked back to his chair and sat down, his movements carrying the unhurried calm of a man who has been waiting a long time to arrive at this exact moment and intends to take his time now that he's here. For 3 months, you've been making moves, thinking you were hunting me. But every move you made, every decision you thought was brilliant, every moment you thought you were gaining ground, you were following a path I laid out for you. The room was so quiet you could hear the city outside. I needed you to commit crimes I could document. I needed you to make enemies I could turn into allies. I needed you to expose your network so I could map it completely. And most importantly, I needed you to disrespect me publicly in front of witnesses so that when I destroyed you, no one could say it wasn't justified. Torino's hands were shaking. You're saying this was all a setup? Bumpy's smile was gentle, almost fatherly. Vincent, from the moment you stepped foot in Harlem, you've been a dead man. The only question was whether you'd die as a cautionary tale or as a legend. He paused. You chose cautionary tale. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a manila envelope thick with papers. Inside this envelope is everything. Every crime you've committed in my territory. Every law you've broken. every person you've hurt, every dirty deal you've made, all documented, all verified, all ready to be delivered to the right people at exactly the right moment. Torino looked around the room desperately. The neutral witnesses from the old Italian families were watching with the focused attention of men who understood they were seeing something they would describe for the rest of their lives. "The families won't stand for this," Torino said. "They won't let you." Bumpy's expression didn't change. "The families, Vincent. Who do you think gave me permission to handle this situation however I saw fit? Did you really believe you could operate in Harlem for 3 months without the old families knowing every move you made?" The envelope landed on the table with a sound like a judge's gavel. "You threw whiskey in my face tonight, thinking you were humiliating me. What you actually did was give me the final piece I needed. Because now, every man in this room witnessed you cross a line that can't be uncrossed. Now, when your body turns up in the East River tomorrow morning, it won't be murder, it will be justice." The words settled over the room like a death shroud. And then Bumpy did something that no one saw coming. He picked up the envelope and handed it to Vincent Torino. "But I'm not going to kill you." The confusion in Torino's eyes was almost pitiable. "That would be too easy," Bumpy continued. "Too quick, too merciful. You're going to take that envelope and walk out of here tonight. And then you're going to spend every remaining day of your life knowing that I own you completely, that I could destroy you with a phone call, that your life exists only because I choose to allow it to exist." He leaned forward, dropping his voice to a whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the room. "Because death is final, Vincent. But living with the knowledge that you were completely outmatched by the man you tried to destroy, that's a lesson that lasts forever." The envelope trembled in Torino's hands as the full magnitude of his situation crashed down on him. He had been played so completely, so thoroughly, that even mercy felt like defeat. He was walking out of this room not as a victor, not as a man who had been spared, but as a man who would spend the rest of his life understanding exactly how small he really was. He took the envelope, he stood, he walked toward the door, and the soldiers who had come with him fell in behind him, quieter than they had ever been in their lives. At the door, Torino paused. Whatever was left of his pride made one final desperate attempt to recover something from the wreckage of the evening. "This isn't over, Johnson." Bumpy didn't look up from the table. He had already picked up his glass and was examining the whiskey remaining in it with casual interest. "Get some rest, Vincent. You look tired." Torino left. The two neutral witnesses from the old Italian families sat in silence for a long moment after the door closed. Then one of them, a man named Sal, who had been in the business for 40 years and had seen more confrontations than he could count, looked at Bumpy Johnson and said the only thing that seemed adequate to what had just happened. "I've never seen anything like that." Bumpy finally smiled again. The same smile from before, the one that had started everything. "Yes, you have," he said. "You just never saw it done this well." 3 days later, Vincent Torino was arrested by federal agents outside Gino's Steakhouse on a Thursday evening. The charges were racketeering, extortion, assault, and conspiracy to distribute narcotics. The flashbulbs from the reporters who had been pre-positioned on the street captured every moment of his humiliation for the following morning's front pages. The arrest had been coming for months, but the specific evidence that made it airtight, the documented crimes, the turned witnesses, the financial records, had all been assembled by a man sitting in a restaurant back room who had let whiskey drip down his face and smiled while it happened. Every crime documented in the envelope Bumpy had given Torino was now federal evidence. Every witness Bumpy had cultivated was now a federal witness. Every piece of leverage Torino thought he had held was now the foundation of a case that would put him away for 20 years. But what made it truly devastating was how the newspapers covered it. The arrest was reported not as the result of any vendetta or underworld justice. It was presented as the culmination of a careful, methodical law enforcement investigation. Torino was painted not as a powerful man brought down by a worthy opponent, but as a small-time thug who had gotten too ambitious and underestimated the reach of federal law enforcement. The humiliation was complete, public, permanent, and Bumpy Johnson's name appeared nowhere in any of it. In the weeks that followed, the story of what had happened at Ralph's restaurant spread through every level of organized crime in New York with the speed and inevitability of a fire through dry wood. The details shifted as they passed from person to person, as details always do. Some versions made the confrontation more violent, some added dialogue that had never been spoken, but the core remained unchanged across every telling. Torino had thrown a drink in Bumpy Johnson's face. Bumpy had smiled, and 3 days later, Torino was in federal custody. The lesson was so clean, so complete, so perfectly constructed that even the men who had been in the room struggled to fully articulate what they had witnessed, because it wasn't just that Bumpy had won. It was the manner of the winning, the patience of it, the 3 months of invisible preparation, the turned soldiers, the documented crimes, the permission secured from the old families before the first move was ever made. The understanding that Torino's arrogance was not an obstacle to be overcome but a resource to be harvested. And perhaps, most remarkably, the handkerchief. In later years, whenever the story was told in back rooms and private clubs, whenever old operators tried to identify the single moment that captured everything there was to know about how Bumpy Johnson operated, they always came back to the handkerchief, not the smile, not the envelope, not the federal arrest. The moment when he reached into his pocket, produced a white handkerchief, and wiped the whiskey from his face with the unhurried care of a man performing a routine personal grooming task. That gesture communicated everything. It said that what had just been done to him was not worthy of a response beyond the minimal maintenance of his own appearance. It said that Torino's attempt at humiliation had not penetrated the surface. That, whatever Torino believed he had achieved in that moment, he had achieved nothing. The man behind the face was exactly as intact as he had been before the whiskey hit it. The plan was exactly as operational. The outcome was exactly as predetermined. A year after the arrest, a young man who ran numbers in Bumpy's Harlem operation asked him directly about the whiskey. They were sitting in the back of a jazz club on a quiet Tuesday evening, and the young man had been working up the courage to ask the question for months. When he threw that drink, the young man said, "What were you actually thinking?" Bumpy looked at him for a long moment. Then he answered with the honesty of a man who had nothing left to prove to anyone. "I was thinking that it was about time." The young man didn't understand. About time. He'd been taking from me for 3 months, hurting my people, disrespecting everything I'd built, and every day I watched it happen and I did nothing, and every day he got bolder. Because silence looks like weakness to a certain kind of man. And a certain kind of man, when he believes he's found weakness, can't help but push harder. Bumpy picked up his glass. I needed him to push all the way. I needed him to go so far that when the response came, nobody could question whether it was justified. Not the families, not the cops, not his own soldiers. He looked out at the jazz musicians working through a slow late-night tune. The whiskey was the last piece. When he threw that drink, he stopped being a business problem and became a personal offense committed in front of witnesses. That changes everything about what's permissible in response. That's why I thanked him. I meant it. The young man thought about this for a long time. But you could have taken him down anyway. You had the evidence. You had the family's permission. I could have, Bumpy agreed. But this way, every man in that room went home that night, not just knowing that Torino had lost. They went home knowing why he had lost. They went home understanding the specific mechanism of his destruction. And that understanding, that lesson about what happens when you mistake arrogance for power, is worth more than any amount of evidence or permission. He set down his glass. I didn't destroy Vincent Torino. He destroyed himself, the same way men like him always destroy themselves. I just made sure there were enough witnesses to learn from it. The young man turned this over in his mind. And the smile, when the whiskey hit you, was that real? Bumpy Johnson smiled now, the same smile from the back room at Ralph's restaurant. What do you think? The young man thought about it, about the 3 months of invisible preparation, about the turned soldiers and the documented crimes and the federal evidence assembled so carefully that it took down Torino without leaving a single fingerprint pointing back to Harlem. About the handkerchief, folded and placed on the table with the deliberate care of a man performing a ceremony. I think it was real, the young man said. It was the most real thing in that room all night, Bumpy said. Because I wasn't performing. I wasn't pretending to be calm. I was genuinely grateful. The man had just given me exactly what I needed, exactly when I needed it, in exactly the form that made everything that followed not just possible, but inevitable. If you work hard enough and plan carefully enough and have the patience to wait for the right moment, sometimes the universe hands you a gift. He paused. Sometimes that gift arrives in the form of a glass of whiskey thrown in your face by a man who thinks he's winning. 30 years later, when scholars and journalists tried to understand the landscape of organized crime in mid-century New York, they would point to Vincent Torino's arrest as a turning point. Not because of the charges themselves, which were significant but not unprecedented, but because of what the arrest represented. Because of the message it sent through every level of the criminal underworld in New York and beyond. The message was simple. There are 2 kinds of power. The kind that performs itself, that requires constant demonstration, that measures its strength by how small it can make others feel. And the kind that builds itself, that operates invisibly, that measures its strength by how thoroughly it understands the field it operates on. The first kind is loud. The first kind throws drinks and makes speeches and fills rooms with the noise of its own confidence. The first kind mistakes volume for substance and arrogance for intelligence. The second kind is quiet. The second kind sits in a back room on a Tuesday night and lets whiskey drip down its face and smiles. The second kind has already made every necessary decision before the evening begins. The second kind doesn't need to be loud because it has already won. It is simply waiting for events to catch up with the outcome it has prepared. Vincent Torino represented the first kind. He had built a career on it. He had accumulated power through it. And he had walked into a room with a man who represented the second kind and made the fundamental error of believing that the absence of noise indicated the absence of strength. That error cost him everything: his operation, his reputation, his freedom, and ultimately, in the economy of the streets, where reputation is the only currency that truly matters, his identity. Because the man who had once been known as the Shark, who had commanded genuine fear in the back rooms and on the docks of New York, became known as something else after that Thursday evening outside Gino's steakhouse. He became known as the man who threw a drink in Bumpy Johnson's face and went to prison for it. He became, in the most complete and permanent way available, an example. The whiskey dried on Bumpy Johnson's collar long before any of this was clear. But the lesson it had been used to teach, the demonstration of what happens when performed arrogance meets genuine intelligence, when noise meets silence, when the first kind of power meets the second, would outlast everyone who had been in that room. It outlasted the room itself, which was demolished in 1974 to make way for a parking structure. It outlasted most of the men who had been present, who died in the various ways that men in their profession tended to die. It outlasted Vincent Torino, who served 18 years of his 20-year sentence and was released into a world that had entirely forgotten his name, and who died 11 months after his release in a small apartment in Queens with no visitors and no obituary. What it did not outlast was Bumpy Johnson himself, whose reputation, carefully built over decades and demonstrated on that night with a handkerchief and a smile, only grew in the years that followed. Grew and deepened and took on the particular quality of legend that attaches itself to men who operate at a level most people can barely perceive, let alone reach. They still tell the story in certain rooms. Old men who were young in 1955, who heard about the back room at Ralph's restaurant from someone who had been there, or from someone who had heard from someone who had been there, who understand that the story is not really about whiskey, or about one man's downfall, or even about Bumpy Johnson's tactical brilliance. The story is about something that matters more than any of those things. It is about the radical, almost incomprehensible patience required to let a man humiliate you in public, because you understand that the humiliation is the last piece of the puzzle. The willingness to absorb an indignity in the short term, because you can see clearly, in a way your opponent cannot, that the indignity is the mechanism of his destruction. It is about the difference between reacting and responding, between impulse and strategy, between the man who throws the drink and the man who reaches for his handkerchief. The whiskey hit Bumpy Johnson's face on a cold Tuesday evening in 1955. He wiped it off with a folded white handkerchief. He placed the handkerchief on the table. He smiled. 3 days later, Vincent the Shark Torino was in federal custody. Some lessons write themselves. The good ones just need the right teacher to make sure the classroom is full when they're delivered.